From the Encyclopedia Britannica, 11th edition, entry on Prussia. Prussian fire discipline. On approaching the enemy, the marching columns of Prussians wheeled in succession to the right or left, passed along the front of the enemy until the rear company had wheeled. Then the whole together wheeled into line facing the enemy. These movements brought the infantry into two long, well-closed lines. Parade ground precision obtained thanks to remorseless drilling. With this movement was bound up a fire discipline more extraordinary than any perfection of maneuver. Peloton Führer was opened at 200 paces from the enemy and continued up to 30 paces, when the line fell on with the bayonet. The possibility of this combination of fire and movement was the work of Leopold, who by sheer drill made the soldier a machine capable of delivering, with flintlock muzzle-loading muskets, 5 volleys a minute. The special Prussian fire discipline gave an advantage of 5 shots to 2 against all opponents. The bayonet attack, if the rolling volleys had done their work, was merely presenting the check for payment, as a German writer put it. The particular utopia American believers chose to bring to the schoolhouse was Prussian. The seed that became American schooling 20th century style was planted in 1806, when Napoleon's amateur soldiers bested the professional soldiers of Prussia at the Battle of Jena. When your business is renting soldiers and employing diplomatic extortion under the threat of your soldiery, losing a battle like that is pretty serious. Something had to be done. The most important immediate reaction to Jena was an immortal speech, the Address to the German Nation, by philosopher Johann Fichte, one of the influential documents of modern history leading directly to the first workable compulsion schools in the West. Other times, other lands talked about schooling, but failed to deliver. Simple force training for brief intervals and for narrow purposes was the best that had ever been managed. This time would be different. Under no uncertain terms, Fichte told Prussia the party was over. Children would have to be disciplined through a new form of universal conditioning. They could no longer be trusted to their parents. Look what Napoleon had done by banishing sentiment in the interests of nationalism. Through forced schooling, everyone would learn that work makes free, and working for the state, even laying down one's life to its commands, was the greatest freedom of all. Here in the genius of semantic redefinition lay the power to cloud men's minds, a power later packaged and sold by public relations pioneers Edward Bernays and Ivy Lee in the seed time of American forced schooling. Prior to Fichte's challenge, any number of compulsion school proclamations had rolled off printing presses here and there. The problem was, earlier ventures were virtually unenforceable, roundly ignored by those who smelled mischief lurking behind fancy promises of free education. Prussia was prepared to use bayonets on its own people as readily as it wielded them against others. So it's not at all that surprising that the human race got its first effective secular compulsion schooling out of Prussia in 1819. The same year Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, set in the darkness of far-off Germany, was published in England. Shelley came after more than a decade of deliberations, commissions, testimony, and debate. The Prussian mind had a clear idea of what centralized schooling should deliver. 1. Obedient soldiers to the army. 2. Obedient workers for mines, factories, and farms. 3. Well-subordinated civil servants trained in their function. 4. Well-subordinated clerks for industry. 5. Citizens who thought alike on most issues. And 6. National uniformity in thought, word, and deed. The area of individual volition for commoners was severely foreclosed by Prussian psychological training procedures drawn from the experience of animal husbandry and equestrian training, and also taken from past military experience. Much later, in our own time, the techniques of these assorted crafts and sullen arts became discoveries in the pedagogical pseudoscience of psychological behaviorism. Prussian schools delivered everything they promised. Every important matter could now be confidently worked out in advance by leading families and institutional heads, because well-schooled masses would concur with a minimum of opposition. The tightly schooled consensus in Prussia eventually combined the kaleidoscope German principalities into a united Germany, after 1,000 years as a nation in fragments. What a surprise the world would soon get from this successful experiment in national centralization. Under Prussian state socialism, private industry surged, vaulting resource-poor Prussia up among the world leaders. Military success remained Prussia's touchstone, even before the school law went into full effect as an enhancer of state priorities. The Army Corps was the principal reason for Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, its superb discipline allowing for a surprisingly successful return to combat after what seemed to be a crushing defeat at the Little Corporal's hands just days before. Unschooled, the Prussians were awesome. Conditioning in the classroom promised to make them even more formidable. The immense prestige earned from this triumph reverberated through an America not so lucky in its own recent fortunes of war, a country humiliated by a shabby showing against the British in the War of 1812. 30 years after Prussia made state schooling work, we borrowed the structure, style, and intention of those Germans for our own first compulsion schools. Traditional American school purpose, piety, good manners, basic intellectual tools, self-reliance, etc., was scrapped to make way for something different. Our historical destination of personal independence gave way slowly to Prussian purpose schooling, not because the American way lost in any competition of ideas, but because for the new commercial and manufacturing hierarchs, such a course made better economic sense. The private advance towards nationalized schooling in America was partially organized, although little had ever been written about it. Orestes Brownson's journal identifies a covert national apparatus, to which Brownson briefly belonged, already in place in the decade after the War of 1812. One whose stated purpose was to Germanize America, beginning in those troubled neighborhoods where the urban poor huddled and where disorganized new immigrants made easy targets, according to Brownson. Enmity on the part of the old stock middle class and working class populations toward newer immigrants gave these unfortunates no appeal against the school sentence to which Massachusetts assigned them. They were in for a complete makeover, like it or not. Much of the story, as it has been written by 1844, lies just under the surface of Mann's florid prose in his 7th annual report to the Boston School Committee. On a visit to Prussia the year before, he had been much impressed, so he said, with the ease by which Prussian calculations could determine precisely how many thinkers, problem solvers, and working stiffs the state would require over the coming decade. Then, how it offered the precise categories of training required to develop the percentages of human resource needed. All this was much fairer to Mann than England's repulsive episcopal system, schooling based on social class. Prussia, he thought, was republican in the desirable, manly, Roman sense. Massachusetts must take the same direction.